At 80 years old, Eric Clapton has nothing left to prove. He's already secured his place in the pantheon of rock history. His name alone evokes a language of reverence: guitar virtuoso, blues pioneer, survivor. But beneath the myth of Clapton lies a life of unraveling complexity, of friendships that shaped generations, rivalries that never fully vanished, and wounds that never quite healed. Among all the great connections he's had in his volatile, glorious, and painful career, one remains more enigmatic, more tender, and more profoundly human than the rest: his relationship with George Harrison. Today, with the haze of ego long since cleared, Clapton is no longer hiding behind guitars or songs. He speaks with a softness that only age can earn. And slowly, truth has begun to surface about love, pain, regret, and the quiet resilience of a friendship that defied expectation. The truth he finally tells isn't scandalous. It's not meant for gossip or clickbait. It's something far more powerful, the kind of truth that sits with you long after the music fades. To understand the magnitude of Clapton's revelation, you have to go back not just to the hits, the heartbreaks, and the headlines, but to two young men searching for meaning in melodies. Long before tension, before love triangles and betrayals, there were just two guitarists caught in the eye of a revolution. George Harrison was the quiet Beatle, soft-spoken but spiritually deep, a man whose playing never screamed, but always sang. Clapton, on the other hand, was raw fire. His style stormed through solos with raging purpose. Where George was zen, Clapton was chaos. And yet, they met in the middle, where something unspoken but solid grew. With their paths first formally crossed in the late 1960s, when Clapton was already crashing through London's underground rock scene, and Harrison, riding the global wave of Beatlemania, began looking beyond pop stardom into something more real, more grounded. It was music, not fame, that connected them. Respect anchored their bond. Harrison admired Clapton's boldness, the way he played like his soul was on the line. Clapton, in turn, saw George not just as a Beatle, but as a musician with extraordinary emotional insight. Their hearts beat in sync with the same off-kilter rhythm. And in a world spinning with noise, they found peace in their collisions, but the very thing that connected them would also strain their bond. When Clapton was asked to contribute to Harrison's hauntingly poetic track "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," it was a seemingly small gesture that carried enormous weight. Clapton was not a Beatle. The band rarely allowed outsiders in, especially not during studio sessions. But George insisted. He trusted Eric. That trust was rare, especially then. And Clapton matched the trust with a performance that poured all his feel and brilliance into a single guitar weep, a cry that pierced through the polished pop surface, anchoring the song in grief and longing. Looking back, Clapton recalls that moment as a turning point. "I wasn't just playing a part," he later said. "I was telling a truth I hadn't spoken yet. It was the sound of something deeper than admiration. Something deeper than even loyalty, because by then, Clapton was already harboring a secret that would unravel everything. He had fallen in love, not just with anyone. With Pattie Boyd, George Harrison's wife. The same woman who had inspired George's timeless ballad "Something," and the same woman who would later ignite the aching wail of Clapton's Layla. For years, Eric kept his feelings buried, tangled in secrecy, shame, and longing. The love triangle that would later become the subject of endless books and speculation began not with betrayal, but with confusion. Love doesn't always announce itself with clarity. Sometimes, it creeps in quietly, disguised as friendship, sanctuary, or even inspiration. Clapton would later describe those years as unbearable. He was torn between the deepest respect for Harrison and a yearning he couldn't silence. "George was my brother," Clapton reflected decades later. Which made the whole thing impossible. The internal war raged on, seeding cracks in both his psyche and, eventually, his career. He buried that pain in music, where only chords and lyrics knew how to carry what mere words couldn't say. But the world of rock and roll is rarely built on stability. What followed would change all of their lives and test their friendship in ways no one saw coming. In the story of Eric Clapton and George Harrison, there are no clear villains or heroes, only flawed, brilliant men crossing through storms of emotion they were never taught how to navigate. When Clapton finally confessed his love to Pattie Boyd, it wasn't through words at first. It was through the blazing, desperate cries of Layla, a song so raw that even those who didn't know the backstory could feel the pain clawing through each note. When the album Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs dropped in 1970 under Clapton's short-lived group Derek and the Dominoes, it felt like a sonic upheaval, and it left no doubt about who had inspired it. What followed was the unspoken becoming scene. Harrison, though deeply private, was not blind. nor was he naive. The tension between the three of them, George, Eric, and Patty, shifted from subtext to front stage, but in a bizarre twist that only deepens the mythos of the moment, Harrison didn't lash out. He didn't publicly humiliate or attack Clapton. The Beatles were already unraveling by that time, and Harrison's mind had begun to wander into spiritual questions far bigger than the dramas of romantic entanglements. Perhaps that's why his response stunned so many. He forgave, but he didn't forget that behind closed doors, Harrison was hurt. How could he not be? His best friend had fallen in love with his wife, and his wife eventually returned the affection. The emotional complexity was staggering. Friendships in most walks of life have crumbled under far less. But somehow, they never stopped speaking. In fact, they kept playing together. Perhaps that was their secret salvation, that shared language of music that allowed them to say what couldn't be said face to face. Clapton would later describe those years as living next to a volcano. Any wrong word could cause an eruption. But somehow, they found a way to keep walking the fault line without falling in. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Harrison and Boyd divorced. A few years later, Clapton and Boyd were married. It should have spelled disaster, the final nail in the coffin of their friendship. Instead, against all logic and social norms, George Harrison attended the wedding, and he brought a gift. It wasn't material. It wasn't passive-aggressive bitterness wrapped in civility. It was simple. It was powerful. He brought his blessing. Whether it was resignation, grace, or some deeper acknowledgement of how tangled life had become, Clapton never forgot it. George carried peace with him, he would say years later. Even when he had every reason not to. Still, no friendship survives unscathed. While they continued to meet, record, and occasionally perform together, there was always an invisible line that couldn't be uncrossed. Their laughter became tinged with things unspoken, late-night jams a little more melancholic. And yet, when the two shared a stage, it was as if the world hushed. When Clapton and Harrison played side by side, especially in the years that followed, their guitars didn't duel. They conversed. Not in grandstanding solos, but soft bends of tone, space, and silence. You could almost hear an apology in the phrasing, or perhaps acceptance. Clapton has often said that Harrison's playing was never about proving he was the best. It was about making the songs better. George wasn't trying to outplay anyone, Clapton recalled. He was trying to make something beautiful. And that taught him more than all the jam sessions, rehearsals, or studio takes combined. Because Clapton, once known for his intensity and competitive presence on the fretboard, began to change too. Age, pain, and perhaps George's quiet influence reshaped how he saw music and friendship. The years passed, and life took more than it gave. Clapton spiraled further into addiction, dropped into darkness, and clawed his way back more than once. Harrison, meanwhile, leaned into spiritual practice, gardening, and fatherhood, gradually stepping away from the limelight, but never the music. When George was diagnosed with cancer in the late 1990s, Clapton visited him often. Not as a rock god, not as a rival or even the remarried ex-husband of his former wife. He came as a friend. Their conversations grew sparse, words becoming less important. Clapton admits they talked less and less over time, not out of discomfort, but out of knowing. Sometimes they'd sit in silence, and that silence was enough. With George, he said softly, you always felt like you were in the presence of someone who understood something you didn't. But he never made you feel less for not knowing. When Harrison passed away in 2001, Clapton was devastated. The grief wasn't loud. There was no meltdown, no public display of loss. Instead, there was music. The best way Clapton knew how to mourn wasn't with a eulogy, it was with a guitar. So he organized the concert for George, a tribute so intimate and powerful that even now, decades later, it remains one of the most heartfelt goodbyes in music history. Friends, former bandmates, and family gathered not just to remember a Beatle, but to honor a man whose light touched every soul he encountered. The concert for George wasn't just a tribute, it was catharsis. For Clapton, it was the final act in a friendship that had defined so many corridors of his life. He didn't just organize the event, he became its heartbeat. Surrounded by legends Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Jeff Lynne, Tom Petty, Clapton stood not as the center of attention, but as a humble thread knitting them all together in shared memory. He played not to dazzle, but to honor. And as the final chord rang out, there was a sense that something sacred had been given back to the world, but the morning didn't end with the music. In interviews that followed, Clapton's voice took on a quiet tremble anytime Harrison's name came up. There was respect in his tone, but also a sadness, the kind that lingers when words have been left unsaid. He had this light about him, Clapton said once, eyes fixed somewhere far off. Even when life got dark, George carried peace with him. I miss him every day. And the truth is, I'll never stop missing him. There was something undeniably pure in Clapton's grief. And maybe that's because the weight of their past, the betrayals, the love triangle, the unspoken conflicts, never truly erased the foundation of what they had shared. If anything, those imperfections made their bond more real. More human. Today, at 80, Clapton no longer speaks as a man chasing charts or trying to outrun his demons. The wild-eyed bluesman who once scorched stages with Cream now seems further away than ever. Time has softened him. Addiction nearly destroyed him. Fame jaded him. But surviving all that stripped away the bravado. What remains is raw honesty and understanding that the greatest story he ever lived wasn't the fame or the guitars or even the iconic songs. It was the friendship, because George Harrison wasn't just a Beatle to Clapton. He was a mirror. A rival. A companion through decades of chaos, who somehow managed to remain unchanged by it. In a world where relationships often crumble under ego and excess, there stood bent, but unbroken. And that, in itself, might be Harrison's greatest legacy. Clapton has long since accepted that much of their story became legend, twisted in tabloids and romanticized in books. But the truth, the one he finally tells at 80, is much quieter. It lies not in the drama, but in the stillness. In the moments they didn't speak. In the way George would offer him vegetables from his garden. In the way he never held Clapton's betrayal like a weapon. Instead, he held it like a truth. One that didn't need forgiveness, only understanding. He knew I loved her, Clapton once admitted with clear eyes. And he never made me feel like I was evil for it. That changed me. In many ways, Harrison forced Clapton to confront himself more than any drug ever could. And through that confrontation, Clapton began to evolve not just as a man, but as an artist. It's impossible to talk about George Harrison's influence without talking about how deeply spiritual he was, something that baffled and fascinated Clapton in equal measure. While Eric was drowning in substances during much of the 70s, George was embracing meditation, Eastern philosophies, and inner stillness. To Clapton, it was all a bit otherworldly but undeniably powerful. Harrison never tried to preach, never imposed his beliefs. He simply practiced quietly, consistently, as if his peace was portable and freely offered to anyone who needed it. That unshakable calm became a quiet lifeline for Clapton during his darkest periods. And though they didn't always talk about it, Clapton knew that George was one of the few people who truly saw the war inside him, the addict, the artist, the broken child pretending to be a god. And still, George never turned away. No documentary, no biography, no rock magazine ever truly captured the subtlety of that connection. Because what defined Eric and George wasn't just the love triangle, or the music, or the shared stages. It was the grace. The way they stood by each other, even as life gave them every reason not to, and if their friendship was made of contradictions, then maybe that's why it endured. Because somewhere between the fame and the fallout, between the charts and the heartbreaks, they found something far more valuable than harmony. They found truth. A truth Clapton is finally able to speak now, without shame or fear. A truth he carried for decades, wrapped in distortion and delay pedals, echoed through verses he could never quite finish. I didn't always know how to be a good friend, Clapton has said. But George, he showed me what grace looked like. And in today's world, where forgiveness is rarer than applause, and where peace feels like fiction, theirs was a rare story of both. A story of flaws, but also of faith. A story not of perfection, but of preservation. In many ways, the friendship between Eric Clapton and George Harrison defies the logic we've come to expect from celebrity relationships, especially in a world fueled by ego, competition, and endless public scrutiny. If you stripped away the guitars, the stadiums, and the women, what remained at the core of their bond was something strikingly human: vulnerability. And that's perhaps the greatest truth Clapton is now ready to reveal in full, not the scandalous version the tabloids always chased, but the quiet, aching kind of truth that doesn't know how to make headlines, only memories. Clapton has admitted in recent interviews that even years after George's passing, there are songs he can no longer play the same way. Not because of physical aging or technical loss, but because of emotional saturation. Every note triggers history. Every pause recalls a look, or a laugh, or a wound that never quite healed. Some chords just echo too loud, he once said, because they carry ghosts. It's a powerful sentiment and one that perhaps only musicians can truly grasp. The idea that music is not just a career, but a time machine. A photograph in sound. For Clapton, those songs became sacred relics. And Harrison? He was etched into the very frequencies that Clapton still strums. Even now, their connection, though marked by extraordinary highs and agonizing lows, wasn't linear. It wove in and out through marriages, addiction, comebacks, and global fame. They were on different trajectories, spiritually and personally. Yet somehow, they always looped back to each other like different verses in the same song. There were times when they barely spoke, times when they laughed like teenagers again, and times when Clapton would watch Harrison from afar, trying to understand how a man could face death with such acceptance. But it wasn't just Harrison's death that changed Clapton. It was his extraordinary grace while living. People often talk about George's spirituality in vague, poetic terms as if it were some mystic fog that followed him around. Clapton is more direct. George believed in something beyond all this, he said, gesturing upwards during a rare interview. And it wasn't about religion or image. It was authentic. I think that unnerved some people, including me. Because while Clapton was battling the demons of fame and addiction, Harrison seemed to battle only himself. And often, he won. His retreat into simplicity, gardening, prayer, fatherhood wasn't performative. It was survival. In fact, Clapton later confessed that Harrison's quiet devotion to a path of peace slowly began to influence how he sought his own chaos. It didn't happen overnight. In fact, it didn't happen during the years when media painted Clapton as rock's tortured genius, or as the reckless romantic in the center of an infamous love triangle. It happened after everything burned down, after the fame had dulled, after the marriage failed, after the bottle couldn't numb what was left, and through that internal rebuilding, Clapton began revisiting George's words, his actions, the intentional way he moved through life unbothered by noise and determined to leave the world just a little softer than he found it. There is a moment Clapton rarely shares, but when he does, there's a different tone in his voice. It's about the final weeks of Harrison's life. During one of his last visits, Clapton sat quietly next to George's hospital bed. George was frail, but his eyes still held that familiar fire, not of resistance, but of surrender. And in that silence, Clapton remembered something George once told him decades earlier: all things must pass. At the time, Clapton thought it was just a lyric. Now, it's something else entirely. It's a philosophy. A warning. A comfort. After Harrison's passing, those words sounded less like resignation and more like permission. Permission to grieve. To let go. And perhaps, most importantly, to keep living. George taught me that holding on can sometimes be the heaviest thing you ever carry, Clapton explained. And letting go, that's where the real freedom is. That lesson didn't just shape Clapton's music going forward. It shaped his silence, too. Because while he continued to play on stages across the world, there was a deeper restraint to his performances, a tenderness, a humility, a kind of reverence that hadn't always been there before. Gone was the need to dominate the room with a blistering solo. In its place was something wiser, quieter. That's the evolution Harrison sparked, not just in Clapton, but in anyone who truly listened to him. Friendships and rock music often ignite in chaos and disappear just as fast. But Clapton and Harrison existed outside that pattern. They took the long road through hurt and healing, fame and forgiveness. And in doing so, they modeled something profoundly rare, a brotherhood that bent under pressure but refused to break. So when Clapton finally speaks openly today about George at 80, reflecting on a life most fans could only dream of, he doesn't talk about rivalry or regret in the ways people expect. He talks about light. About peace. About a man who never stopped growing flowers, even as the world around him wilted. And in that reflection, Clapton sees what he might have missed in their younger years, that the greatest guitar Harrison ever played was the one he strummed quietly through every soul he touched, and Clapton was, and always will be, one of them. As the final years of Clapton's life unfold like a slow, reflective ballad, he's become more than an icon, more than God scribbled on alley walls by adoring fans. He's now a witness. A conduit between past and present, carrying the stories of a generation that gave the world more than just music. They gave it feeling. And among all the names, the stages shared, and the miles traveled, George Harrison lingers in Clapton's story like a faded chord always present, always resonant, yet, it took Clapton decades to say these things out loud. Not because he didn't feel them, but because putting language to certain truths can be like pulling yourself apart. Besides, in music, you can hide within the instruments. Words are far more dangerous. They demand precision, finality, admission. And Clapton, a man born for the guitar, not the podium, didn't know how to talk about George without reliving the parts of himself he'd rather forget, but at 80, the fear is gone. The bravado, too. What's left is something gentler, reflection without defensiveness. A quiet need to make things clear before the lights fully dim. The truth isn't dramatic. It's not even new. It's been there in the spaces between guitar notes, in the hidden tracks of albums, in the silences at the end of performances. The truth is this: George Harrison shaped Eric Clapton. Not musically, though there, too, Harrison left his fingerprints. But spiritually, emotionally. In how Clapton came to understand forgiveness, dignity, and restraint, perhaps the most poetic twist is that Clapton, known for his yearning and burning sound, came to admire in George the very qualities he lacked and desperately needed: patience, faith, balance. Harrison never rushed to win arguments or dominate a room. He simply was grounded in his beliefs, generous with his time, and kind even under pressure. And that steady presence stood in stark contrast to the chaos Clapton often found himself caught in during his younger years. People love the story of the love triangle, the drama of Clapton stealing his best friend's wife. But that's the surface tale, the breadcrumb trail that tabloids and fans latch onto. What they miss is what happened after. Not just the forgiveness, but the invisible rebuilding. The transformation no camera ever caught. Clapton didn't steal Pattie Boyd and ride off into happily ever after. Their marriage was as rocky as any. Miscarriages, infidelities, desperate attempts at IVF, and the aching failure to build the family Clapton had always dreamed of. And while he found joy later with Melia McHenry and their 3 daughters, the years in between were hollowed out by addiction and regret. But through all that sorrow, George remained a presence, not hovering in judgment, not retreating in bitterness, but lingering like a song you don't expect to hear, yet somehow plays just when you need it. They didn't call each other every week. They weren't inseparable. But theirs was a friendship that no longer needed to be loud to be loyal. It had matured, aged, and like good music, it deepened in meaning long after the recording stopped. That's why the loss hit so hard. Clapton has seen many friends go, from Hendrix to Jack Bruce, from Stevie Ray Vaughan to Ginger Baker. But George was different. Losing George felt like losing a part of himself he hadn't even fully understood until it was gone. That realization birthed the concert for George, but it also lingered far beyond the stage. Over the years, Clapton continued to weave Harrison's spirit into his own performances. He could be playing blues, classic rock, or even acoustic, but there'd always be that one unexpected note, that shift in dynamic, that subtle space left for silence. And any real fan, listening closely, could hear it, George still playing through him. And maybe that's what Clapton means now, during interviews where his voice cracks and his phrases slow, when he says, George never really left. Because some friendships outlive the people in them.